Broadcasting from the heart of Orlando, Florida, you are listening to the most electrifying show in media, A Neighbor's Choice Radio. I am your host, David Gornoski, and thank you for joining me on A Neighbor's Choice. If you'd like to call in to join in on the discussion today, we're going to have a fire-packed show today, a lot of things to get to. The number to call is 407-916-5400. That's 407-916-5400. And there's all kinds of news going on in the day, especially if you're obsessed with the swamp, folks. No, there was a big hearing today with Peter Strzok, the infamous FBI agent who was overseeing the Clinton email investigation at the FBI, as well as the initial investigation that led to the current special prosecutor investigation for Trump with the alleged Russian collusion. And it was a circus. I remember I was just watching the proceedings in Congress today, and you would hear the people, especially those on the Democratic Party side, they were screaming a lot, and they would clap when Peter Strzok would do an epic sermon about how there is nothing. He was very adamant. There is nothing to ever question the integrity of the FBI process. And he was basically suggesting to even hint that I had a preference is to demean the sanctity of the FBI. And that just goes to show you, folks, what we're dealing with when we fixate on Washington to get our problems solved. I mean, the FBI ostensibly was designed to protect us from actual violent criminals, to protect us ostensibly, they tell us, from foreign autocrats like Putin and Putin's personal chef, who the intelligence officials are saying cooked up a massive FBI, a massive social media campaign to denigrate the Trump, denigrate the Democrats. But we know that it's all a theatrical farce, folks, because they have yet to find any collusion evidence between Trump and Russia. They spent millions and millions of dollars with a very partisan stacked group of investigators, and still nothing, right? And that's the whole premise of A Neighbor's Choice is don't look to Washington to solve your problems. Roll up your sleeves, use your talent that you have, and most importantly, have the courage to step outside of groupthink and solve the problems ourselves. Go out into your neighborhood, whether you're a small business owner, whether you work for a company or you have a ministry, whatever it is, use your talent and take the courage to take it up a notch. And don't rely on Washington to solve the problems. We have to solve them ourselves. There is no big, deep threat that Trump poses in terms of trying to collude with Russia. There's no evidence of that. I mean, if there's something that comes out, great, if that happens, but there's no evidence that there's ever going to be anything of that kind. It's all just a way of trying to scapegoat Trump because he dared to defy the status quo for foreign policy. He said, hey, here's Russia. They have a lot of commonalities with our culture. They're largely Christian. They're moving more in a desire. Their people are moving more and more for a desire for capitalism. We have a common enemy with terrorists that we need to deal with. Why don't we just work together? Why do we need to have this perpetual one-upmanship that only feeds bureaucratic waste on both sides with spending that never seems to cease? So why not work together? Why not have friendship with them? And that was heresy. That was sheer heresy in the status quo halls of the swamp. The swamp wants perpetual boogeyman overseas that they can keep us scared of so that they can take our liberties and get us to be very malleable people so they can keep running their theatrics and never really dealing with problems. Because if we deal with problems, then what's the point of having them in their giant inflated trillion-dollar budgets? So look at what with Putin. You know, I've tried to explain to you in all of my writings. I write at Daily Caller. Townhall Finance, WorldNet Daily, several other top conservative and alternative media sites. And my premise is always trying to ground what we think about politics in the imitation of the historical person of Jesus. And so how could we do this on the issue of a relationship with Russia? Well, Jesus had a principle. He called it turn the other cheek. And a lot of people think that that's some kind of Hallmark card that, and sometimes people even have the mistake to interpret that as pacifism, but it's quite the opposite. It's actually a proactive way to dismantle systems of evil, systems of violence and oppression by not mirroring the act of aggression, but allowing the act of aggression or violence to fall in on its own weight. So turning of the cheek is not about pacifism. It's not about cowering in the corner and letting someone slap you. No, there is a place for defense and self-defense within the imitation of Jesus that we can model our society through. But turning of the cheek is about dismantling power systems by allowing them to just fall on their own face. So how would you do that if you are concerned about Putin? I'll show you very simple. If you're concerned about Putin being a threat to America, then the way you would disarm that threat is by opening up. If he tries to threaten us, what you would do is you would say, okay, we're going to open up free trade and travel. So we're going to, instead of sanctioning Russia, we're going to just open up even more trade for our companies to trade with companies in Russia and vice versa. And we're going to remove some of the barriers to travel. And what that would do is that would build unity and build alliances, and it would build camaraderie between the people of both countries even stronger. And it would eliminate Putin's ability to scapegoat America as the problem for the people of Russia. And he would have to be internally reforming himself if he wanted to stay popular. But instead, starting with the Obama administration in 2013, that we have done the opposite. We've emboldened and we've enabled Putin by sanctioning him. Because in 2013, before the Obama State Department started meddling in the Ukrainian election, we saw that the people of Russia, they had the highest disapproval ratings for Putin in many, many years. They were unsatisfied with his corruption. They wanted reform, and they wanted it now. And there was a growing, bubbling resentment towards some of the corruption that he was actually doing in the country. And then when we started throwing on the sanctions and started meddling with arming and supporting some of the overthrow in the western part of Ukraine, it naturally rallied the people, the local population of Russians, into the arms of Putin because they feel like, well, I don't like him, but he's the devil I know. He's our guy. He's my local guy. And he's corrupt, but, these guys are sanctioning us for things they shouldn't be sanctioning us for. They should mind their own business and let us run our neighborhood the way we're going to run it. And so what that does is, ever since those sanctions started in the Obama administration, it's only enabled the Putin regime to have unquestionable power. In fact, I remember I was watching the reporter Glenn Greenwald. He spoke recently, and he said that he was just over in Russia, and he said the people who are internally trying to oppose Putin, they've said that this entire Democratic-led Russian witch hunt hysteria has done a terrible thing for dismantling the internal opposition to Putin. So if you want to stop the power of Putin, you turn the other cheek by opening up free trade, free travel. You build unity between our populations, and that will cause the internal population of Russia to put pressure on Putin to reform his ways or get out. So this is how we can use common sense principles that Jesus taught us 2,000 years ago. We can apply them on the headlines today, cut through all the fog, cut through all the silly Peter Stroke jokes, and get to the real solutions that are very easy. So the number is 407-916-5400. Coming up soon, I'll be speaking with Jerry Bowyer, the editor of Townhall Finance, here on News Radio 102.5 WFLA.
Let me save you, let me save you, let me go and no go, no. Let me reach, let me be.
Neighbor's Choice Radio, folks. I'm David Gornoski, your host. And the number to call if you'd like to be a part of the discussion today, it's 407-916-5400. And we are joined now with a good friend of mine, Jerry Bowyer. He is a economics guru. He is the publisher of townhallfinance.com, which is a division of townhall.com. He's also the founder of affluentinvestors.com. And he is a great friend of mine. He's been a very great publisher of some of my articles. And I'm glad to have you here, Jerry. Thank you.
David, I'm glad to be with you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and, I've always enjoyed, your work, and you've been a great supporter, putting me out there, helping me get established in the different publications that you're a figurehead in. And, you've been a fixture for, people who've tuned in to Fox Business and CNBC and Neil Cavuto and a lot of great shows. And you've been a great voice for limited government and liberty economics and also Christian virtue. And you kind of have a great knack for tying all those things together in a really dynamic way. And so I'm glad that we could do that today on our show.
Me too.
So you are really working on, I've seen some of your latest articles at Townhall Finance where you're unpacking some of the things about Jesus's life to make the story of Jesus just pop out for people who sometimes they just kind of abstract Jesus into these kind of disembodied ideas. They're not really rooted in the real historical reality that Jesus was in. And one of the things that you've been doing is kind of showing the economic principles that Jesus helps us understand.
Yes.
What are, in a nutshell, what is the economic principle of Jesus? Maybe you have an insight about what his real kernel of truth is for people who are concerned about economics.
That Jesus thinks very differently about makers than he does about takers of wealth. That he has a different way of dealing with people who are the ones who dig it out of the ground or build it or trade and serve as merchants and essentially are wealth creators than he does about the lifestyle of the people who are the ruling taking class, what some people call the extractive class. So that we tend to treat Jesus like he is a fortune cookie Confucius Jesus,
right,
for whom all of his advice and observations are all interchangeable. Like if you open a fortune cookie, you get, there's some little slip of paper there that gives you a bit of wisdom. Somebody else could have opened that cookie, and it would have been the same. And I don't think that's the right way to look at Jesus, that he's walking around ancient Israel, sometimes in his native Galilee, or where he grew up, Galilee, and sometimes in Judea, which is close to the capital city, and occasionally even in Samaria. And he's encountering different people in different provinces, in different cities, with different economies and different occupations. And if we're not careful, and we usually aren't, we don't notice that he talks differently in those circumstances. That Jesus doesn't have just a pro-money view or an anti-money view. How you get the money, whether you do it by being creative and being an entrepreneur and being a wealth generator versus doing it by using force against other people and political connections and cronyism, that matters to him. So he is pro-commerce, voluntary exchange, pro-entrepreneur, anti-economic exploitation using state power. And what happens is people who are socialists frequently look at those passages where Jesus says something negative about wealth, and even though he's saying something negative about wealth to somebody who is a man of the state, who got it through political connections, they try to twist those words into making Jesus somebody who's against wealth in all forms and therefore against the free market system.
Right, and I've noticed that even in the, I think it was in the book of Acts, is it? Or I'm trying to think. No, excuse me, the book of James, and this is not Jesus' words, but James says something about the rich should howl in terror at the judgment that's coming to you. A friend of mine, theologian David Bentley Hart, he was telling me the other day that that's an indicator that Jesus does not have a good outlook on wealthy. What do you say to that?
I say that David Bentley Hart should pay attention to the context. James, Jesus' brother, was the overseer of Jerusalem. I don't think that, and he's talking, in that particular context. So I would take him in the particular context that he means. And what's really interesting about this is he talks about these. He says, come ye rich men, weep and howl, for the judgments come upon you. He talks to poor people saying, why do you suck up to the rich, basically? That's the Jerry Bowyer paraphrase, when they're the ones who defraud you, implying that there's defrauding involved, that it's not just the presence of wealth, that the wealth is gotten through a process of defrauding which involves the state. And how do I know it involves the state? Because it explicitly says that the rich were dragging the poor before judges, and you had a corrupt legal system in which the poor were defrauded. And to add to that, the Greek word that James uses there for defraud is exactly the same Greek word that his brother Jesus used when Jesus confronted the rich young ruler being archon, senator, basically, when he said, I kept all the commandments, and Jesus, listed the commandments and added, do not defraud, because that's what the man was doing. That's exactly the same word, and that's on the way to Jerusalem. That's exactly the same word that Jesus uses to the rich young senator that his brother James later uses regarding the wealthy ruling political class and their corruption of the courts in order to defraud the poor. So just to sort of that's the low resolution approach that so many theologians just automatically take, which is to just say that anything said about money, any place in the scripture, applies to everybody else for all time. But then you get into this crazy situation where sometimes the Bible says positive things about money, and sometimes the Bible says negative things about money. So then we just fling these passages at one another. The pro-free market people say, here's the pro-wealth passages, and the anti-free market people say, no, here's the anti-wealth passages. And the sensible thing is to look at the passages in context, and what you find is the anti-wealth passages are always given in the context of state exploitation of the poor. Jesus never anywhere in the Gospels confronts a single person in Galilee, where he's from, which was entrepreneurial, small business owners, small freehold farmers. All of his confrontations about wealth take place after he goes down into Judea, which is the political capital of that ancient region.
So he's not sacralizing the market as sacred, but there's clearly not an attack against the notion of private property and voluntary exchange, is there, with Jesus?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say what we mean by sacralizing. I think the market is as sacred as human nature. Mm-hmm. So we're made in the image of God. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So in some sense, we're sacred.
Right.
So what we do when we use our God-given gifts to do something useful for someone else, so useful, in fact, that they're willing to pay us for it, to me, there is a kind of a sacredness to that.
Sure.
But here's the thing about, you use a word like sacred, right? Sacred is something that takes place that's holy, that's set apart.
Right.
Well, what happens when you steal in a sacred context? The old word for that is sacrilege, stealing of church property, stealing of the temple. So I guess I would argue that there is a kind of a sacredness to honest work and honest exchange, which means there's a kind of a sacrilege when people use violence, power, coercion, force, whether it's actual force or the threat of force, to interfere and take away and intrude and take wealth away from people who are voluntarily exchanging from one another. So I'm not sure that I would hold back entirely from the idea that there's a sacredness to honest labor and honest economic productivity.
Is there a particular passage that tends to get thrown by the leftist or socialist type-minded people that is the most problematic for you and the narrative that you're sharing with us here?
Problematic for me, or one that's used a lot?
Well,
I mean, are you asking
what's the most?
What do they like to club us with, or what actually gives me trouble?
Yeah, the troubled one, the one that's like, oh, that's a tough one. Is there one that's a little bit ambiguous that gets you a little bit wrestling with it?
I'm having trouble thinking of one. I guess the thing. Yeah, all right. There is one. When I started in on this Jesus and free market economics, or Jesus and economics question, I'm a free market guy. So I would be inclined to see Jesus saying the things that I already believe. I think it was Albert Schweitzer who said that, the best way to find out what someone thinks about themselves is to get them to write a life of Jesus, because we all read ourselves into Jesus, right? So I was ready to see a completely libertarian free market Jesus. And as I studied the scriptures, deeply on this, I didn't really see much that was a problem. I mean, I saw that a Jesus who was pro-exchange, pro-entrepreneurship, actually pretty clearly there. But there's one area where I didn't want Jesus to take me, where I was a little resistant, but he took me there anyway, which is the idea of debt forgiveness. There's in the Old Testament, there's a law called the Shemitah law, 7-year debt forgiveness. Mm-hmm. The left has tended to use that as a bludgeon. They tried to make it into redistribution. Mm-hmm. I don't really think it's redistribution. It's just a debt limit. As I studied the Gospels really closely, I realized that Jesus actually was saying positive things about the debt remittance law, that he was a Torah-observant Jew, and that he was attacking the ruling class for undermining the Torah at that point. So, that wasn't a huge adjustment for me, but I didn't want to go there. That wouldn't have been my first choice, but it's the first thing Jesus says when he announces his ministry in Luke. It's pretty central. His views on debt are pretty central to the gospel narrative, and I found that, it's not problematic because I changed my view. Right? If I still held on to the idea that debt forgiveness is just a bad idea, then I guess it would be a problem.
I think debt forgiveness.
I'm with him, so it's not a problem anymore.
I don't have a problem with that either, and I think that you look at the Jubilee concept. Isn't that kind of the basis for bankruptcy laws to some degree, right? The idea that we've based that on that principle somewhat as a shadow?
Yeah, it is, because under bankruptcy laws, you can't declare bankruptcy again for 7 years, and your record is expunged for 7 years. So there's a nod in that direction. But I would say that there are libertarian or free market purists who would be against that. Maybe it's because the left started using those laws. The evangelical left, Ron Sider and others in the 80s, started to use the Jubilee and Shemitah laws to kind of push a left agenda. And so I think conservatives or free market types just sort of you know how mimesis works, right? Mm-hmm. If my enemy is for it, I must be against it. So we automatically sort of downplayed or downgraded those laws. Now, whether they apply outside of ancient Israel is a different question, but they're not inherently a bad idea. Otherwise, God would not have put them in the Torah, and Jesus would not have basically critiqued the leaders. A big critique of his leaders of the day was that the scribes were finding technical workarounds.
Let's hold that thought. We'll stay right here on A Neighbor's Choice Radio. You're listening to A Neighbor's Choice on News Talk 102.5 WFLA. And welcome back to A Neighbor's Choice Radio. I'm David Gornoski, and my guest today is Jerry Bowyer, good friend of mine, an economist, and the publisher of townhallfinance.com, where some of my columns, you can find them as well. How's my spelling doing lately, Jerry? Is it doing good when I send you those good pieces?
Oh, they're terrific. They do very well. The last one you did on crowdsourcing the wall was big performer for us. Really did well. A lot of interest in that.
Wow, that's good.
It was a top article for, several days.
Yeah, I guess that's called going a little viral there for conservatives. We need a little more viral stuff for liberty, right?
Right. And the idea of the wall is kind of a viral idea. It's like, stop waiting for a dysfunctional political system. If we need protection there, then, we all have an interest in it, then, let's do it.
Yeah, and if you want to join in to talk to Jerry, he's definitely he's a mind filled with information about financial wisdom and economic principles and Christian biblical teaching. You can call in at 407-916-5400. And at the end of the hour, we'll be speaking with a good friend of mine named Dr. Yu, who's a physicist from NASA, and he'll be explaining some of the things he's doing to work through groupthink in the physics field. But going back to our discussion previous to the break, we were talking about the misunderstandings that people commonly hold when they talk about the historical person of Jesus. And you're right, Jerry, there's this common misconception that he's some kind of a anti-property hippie guru who's really been misappropriated by a lot of violent ideologies, to justify their envy. And I think we need to really knock that into the trash heap of history.
We do, and the thing that knocks bad theories into the trash heap of history is empirical evidence, right?
Right.
I interviewed a guy who's one of the leading archaeologists of Galilee. I read a book of his, reading another book of his, and talked to him, asked him a lot of questions, and sort of to get a deep dig on what he found. he made an interesting observation. He says a lot of the academic work about the historical Jesus was done in like the end of the 70s and into the 80s. That was sort of the seminal period when the academic academy, especially Ivy League and prestige academies, formed their view of Jesus. And what was in the air at that time was the liberation movements of the 60s and 70s. Fidel Castro, you know that was hot. The Sandinistas were very big, in the mainline churches at that time. And so, in essence, Bible scholars remade Jesus in the image of Che Guevara, Fidel Castro, and the Ortega brothers, violent revolutionaries who wanted to take people's property away. And what they did is, because that's their model of how the world works, they simply assumed a peasant revolutionary Jesus from a peasant revolutionary place into existence. The problem is that since the 80s, we've done loads and loads of archaeology in the Holy Land, especially in Galilee, especially in Nazareth and Sepphoris, which was the town that Nazareth was really an exurb of the city called Sepphoris. It was a small town, but it was just outside a big city. So we know a whole lot about the economic life of someone like Jesus in his hometown. And this is a solidly middle-class town, even upper-middle-class, nice houses across the street from the Church of the Nativity, where Jesus, allegedly grew up, the Holy Sepulchre. I forget what the name is, but the Nazareth Church that's built on Jesus' birthplace. Across the street, you've got a nice house. Now, we're not able to dig under the house and know about that house. Sepphoris, which was just outside, was a financial capital, very entrepreneurial. This was a trade zone. See, Upper Galilee had a lot of mountains, so you didn't have a lot of trade. Underneath that, you had big, government control. So Lower Galilee was a place where there was a lot of trade across borders, across barriers, a lot of roads, a lot of Gentiles and Jews trading with one another. So it wasn't Silicon Valley, but it was a fairly prosperous place. So Jesus wasn't from a poor background. And as a tecton, a carpenter, that would have made him upper middle class. My calculation is that would have been 85th or 90th percentile in terms of an income background. So he wasn't among the very poor. Now, Jesus could get along with the poor. He dealt well with poor people, but he also dealt well with rich people. Right. He knew how to recline at table. He knew how to deal with the head of the synagogue. He knew how to deal with Roman officials. He clearly was used to being in the presence of wealthy people as well as non-wealthy people. So he was kind of in the middle. And the Marxist myth of a Jesus part of some kind of proletariat that was kicked out of their houses by the greedy businessmen, well, I mean, that's an interesting theory, but you don't find it anywhere in the archaeological record.
Right, and that goes back to the problem that I've found with the modern politically correct movement or culture that we are steeped in the West, which is they want to weaponize underdogs or perceived underdogs and use them as bludgeons to get revenge, and use violence. But Jesus said, do not resist evil with violence. And that word, people say, well, where does he say that? Well, it says there when he's talking about turning the other cheek, do not resist evil with violence. What's that Greek word? It's antisthenai. Am I pronouncing that right?
Yeah, I think that's right.
And it means to resist with force. And I think a very simple principle, and maybe you can elaborate or correct if there's something else you see there, but a very simple principle for that is, if you think that your neighbor is practicing evil behavior because he's greedy or he's selfish or he's got hateful ideas, you don't use violence if you want to imitate Jesus, right? You just don't do that because you're abandoning what he told you to do.
Yeah, right. And let's put that passage in the Sermon on the Mount into context, because the sort of default position of lots of Christians is to read it as private and personal when it is in fact inherently political. The idea of carrying a pack an extra mile or of being backhanded across the right cheek, this is the language of occupation. The being compelled to carry the pack for a mile is actually legal language under Roman imperial law, that the occupying soldiers could legally force you to do that. So we don't have to drag that passage into a political context. It's already in a political context. And what Jesus saw, as opposed to all the zealots around him who he spent much of his short public life opposing, is that a violent revolution against Rome would be a terrible idea, and it would be very, very destructive. And what was happening is the resentment against Rome was growing and growing and growing, and it wasn't just resentment, it was plans for a violent revolution. Jesus, who did Jesus famously hang out with? Tax collectors and prostitutes, right? And the normal church conversation
so that was like the swamp. That was like his version of D.C. he was hanging out with.
Say again?
He was hanging out with his version of D.C., tax collectors and prostitutes.
Well, yeah, I know, and that's kind of funny. So, but there is a kind of a political context to that. Was he hanging out with rapists? Was he hanging out with thieves? I mean, there's all sorts of bad people he could have been hanging out with. No, tax collectors and prostitutes were particularly despised because they were allied with Rome. Mm-hmm. Rome was the occupier. They put tax collectors in power, and whenever you have soldiers, occupying soldiers, the prostitutes have a ready source of business. So Jesus was opposed specifically because he was dealing with the people who were associating with the Roman occupation. So this stuff's already political, but Jesus was saying, listen, a violent revolution is not going to be the answer. And it wasn't. Israel rejected his advice. When they were given a choice whether to release Barabbas or Jesus, they chose Barabbas, the violent revolutionary. And sometimes gospel translations call him a robber. That doesn't get the Greek. Right. That doesn't get to the Greek. He was a violent revolutionist. He was a terrorist in our modern terminology. He wasn't a guy who's picking pockets. He was a guy who was he was raiding Roman soldiers and trying to kick the Romans out. Mm-hmm. Israel said, we want Barabbas, not Jesus. They followed Barabbas' example for the next generation. They finally had their massive revolt against Rome, and they were utterly and completely destroyed in that revolt. So Jesus' advice was not just good advice morally, it was good advice practically, and ignoring that advice led to the destruction of that entire nation.
Right, and so as we understand imitating Jesus in our context, that should give us some guidance that no, there's no place to be a violent revolutionary. Some people in the extremist, people on the left and right, they want to go in the streets and overthrow, and that's never appropriate if you want to imitate Jesus. But if you are looking to imitate Jesus, there is ways you can condemn power structures, and you can have a relationship with people as neighbors and get them through persuasion or other nonviolent means to get them to see the error of their ways if they are, being greedy in their business, right, or being selfish, right?
Yeah, Jesus was not part of Antifa, and he wasn't part of Timothy McVeigh, and he wasn't tiki torch wielding. He wasn't in the violent revolution because he grew up in Galilee. I mean, that place had been gobbled up by the Assyrians and then gobbled up by the Babylonians. I mean, this was kicked around like a political football. It was hardly ever not under the domination of one or another empire. They learned how it works. There's a lot of Galilean peasant wisdom. I'm not saying Jesus isn't God. I'm not saying he's not omniscient and all the rest of it, but he's also a human being, and he picked up the Galilean peasant wisdom of being in Galilee where you're trapped between where it was like kicked around by like a political football by the competing empires of Assyria and Babylon and the Persians and the Macedonians and then the Romans, and they kind of learned how to get along in the world, and you don't pick fights with superpowers is rule number one of how to get along in the world.
Right, and with the issue with taxes here briefly, I just see that as a way to say, look, don't violently resist Rome. Don't try to, pay your taxes, but realize that what's really going on here is we don't want to perpetuate a system in which the only way we can love our neighbor is through taxation. We got to do it ourselves. We got to roll up our sleeves ourselves, folks. And I've enjoyed this time with you, Jerry. Tell us, what's the latest project you got going on or anything else you'd like to mention here?
The project I've gone on is what we're talking about, is getting it out of my head and out of my notes and down on paper so that people can go and look up the evidence themselves and see that, this is really well-grounded in mainstream scholarship, in translation and linguistics, and in the big biblical archaeology.
Well, it sounds like a book maybe in the future. I don't know.
Could be. Yeah, probably an article series.
I know you're busy with.
If enough people want to read it, we can do a book out of it.
Yeah, so go to townhallfinance.com to read Jerry's work and all the other great stuff on there, including my columns sometimes that pop up there. And also, Jerry, I just want to say thank you for what you're doing. We need more people like you who are showing the liberty principles of Jesus and really cutting through all the noise and confusion. So thanks again for being on the show.
Thank you, David. Same to you. Keep doing what you're doing.
Thanks. All right, folks, you're listening to News Radio 102.5 WFLA, A Neighbor's Choice. I'll be right back. And welcome back to A Neighbor's Choice Radio. I'm your host, David Gornoski, and you are listening, as I said earlier, to the most electrifying show in media. 407-916-5400 is the number to call if you'd like to be a part of it. And as I mentioned to you, I am about getting things done. I don't want to just talk about problems all day. I want to actually provide solutions, folks, because if I was telling you at the beginning, I said we cannot rely on Washington to solve our problems. We cannot rely on sacred cows and groupthink that we've been stuck in for decades sometimes in the way we think about things. And that includes even science. And so one of the things I'll be doing regularly on A Neighbor's Choice, we will look at politics, we'll look at economics, we'll look at the problems that the government is providing for us, but we're not going to stay stuck there, folks. We're not going to stay there, sitting there saying, oh, which team will save us? Who will tell us how to do clean energy? Who will tell us what science should be funded? No. We're done with those old days. This show, A Neighbor's Choice, is about providing real solutions. So you can think, you can be inspired to rethink sacred cows of knowledge. And actually, if you have talents, we want to hear from you. So if you want to email me, david@aneighborschoice.com, david@aneighborschoice.com, if you have something you'd like to contribute, if you have a great idea that can change society. And one of the things that I am excited to do is we're going to be talking about science a lot, because I think there's a problem with science. And one of the problems I have with it is that when you rely on government to solve all of the problems for us, you'll never be able to have the courage to rethink established paradigms. And so you'll see a regular guest here. He's a good friend of mine. His name is Dr. Weiping Yu, and he's a theoretical physicist, folks. Now, I tell people the problems we have, they're very simple to solve. You don't need a rocket scientist, but just in case, we have Dr. Yu in the house today. Dr. Yu.
Oh, thank you, David. Thank you for having me. This is a great show. Congratulations. Okay, my name is Weiping Yu. I work at the Kennedy Space Center as a NASA physicist by training.
So he's working, folks, on rockets. So we've got a rocket scientist in the house, and I consider him my science guru. He's my chief science advisor on all things A Neighbor's Choice. And so he's willing to question paradigms going back even hundreds of years sometimes about what's accepted in the world of physics. And so, Dr. Yu, I just wanted to ask you, do you think we have a problem with physics, and what's going on in physics? It seems like we used to have a day where we would solve and create new technologies. We had cars, we went to the moon, and now we're stuck on something. We're not getting big changes in technology. What's going on?
This is a big question among physics community. We do have problems, and many, especially in theoretical physicists, are very frustrated with the current status quo framework. One of my research, since I have an engineering physics PhD degree, my research is study theoretical and applied physics. And regarding you mentioned about the group thinking,
right?
There is one I believe very important, a group thinking, which actually have a lot of problems. It's about electricity. Sounds like everybody should know what electricity is, right?
Right.
It never makes sense when I was even in high school. We studied electricity, use a water analogy. So they say, okay, we have an electro pressure. So similar like a water pressure goes through the pipe. So electric current flows through pipe. I figured that it never make any sense to me. And then once I get to college and I started questioning, is that really true? Electricity, a flow of electron. And since I'm doing many NASA education outreach program, so I asked so many electrical engineering professors and PhDs. I said, does that make sense to you? Electricity is a flow of particles. So book definition is electricity is a flow of charge. So I asked them, So what is a charge? How to charge flow? So they said, oh, electricity has to be flow of electrons. So I said, how electron can flow at 70% of speed of light? Does that make any sense to you? My answer is everybody feels like it does not make sense.
Mm-hmm. So what is your definition of electricity? What did you discover about electricity by rethinking groupthink? What is your definition of electricity? What is it?
Electricity is not flow of particles. What I discovered, that's, personally, is no particle flowing inside of a solid conducting material.
Wow.
It's vibration. It's a wave motion.
Just like we're doing right now live on radio, we are vibrating, right? This frequency of thought, our feelings, and it's electrifying the airwaves all over Orlando area. Dr. Yu, you have told me there are some secrets to technology we're going to uncover. You're going to have to find out, folks, what those are next week on A Neighbor's Choice Radio. I'm your host, David Gornoski. We'll see you next week, Thursday at 8 o'clock.